Hey everyone, we're going to spend some time going through the term sheet to identify the covenants. As we previously discussed, the covenants might show up in a section in the term sheet called covenants, but they might show up elsewhere as well. And when you're drafting the covenant section of a document, the precedent can be helpful, but what you really need to understand is what your client has agreed to with the counterparty with respect to covenants. Like any deal, there likely won't be an exhaustive list of covenants in the term sheet, but instead there will be a list of important covenants that have been specifically discussed and agreed between the parties, as well as the example of other kind of standard covenants, and perhaps a reference to including generally customary covenants for a transaction of the particular type. So let's walk through the term sheet and figure out what's a covenant, what's not a covenant. At the outset, remember, a covenant is a promise by the borrower to behave or not behave in a certain way. There are three types of covenants that we primarily discuss: negative covenants, affirmative covenants or operational covenants, and financial covenants. Negative covenants will be a restriction on the borrower promising not to do certain things. Affirmative or operational covenants will be a requirement that the borrower do certain things. And finally, financial covenants won't really be a promise by the borrower to behave in a certain way, but instead will be the promise of the borrower to meet certain financial metrics. And then following the identification of the metrics, we will define what the consequence is if the borrower fails to satisfy the financial covenants. And what that consequence might be can take different shapes. And we'll discuss that in future classes. So let's flip through the pages. Again, as we've discussed previously, you'll read the term sheet several times during the course of a transaction, just like you should be reading it several times during the course of our semester. By the end of the transaction, you'll probably know the term sheet practically by heart because you've been through it so many times. So here we go. Start with the first page. The first page, of course, we don't have much here. In this term sheet, and all term sheets can be different as far as how they're laid out, but in this term sheet, we have the first section, which is an executive summary of the transaction, and the second section, which is a list of the parties to the transaction. This is mostly setting the stage for the transaction, but of course has many useful facts. None of these things are really covenants in here, but you're probably very familiar with these things at this point in the semester and in the transaction. We move on to section 3, which is the facility structure. Many of the terms in this section you will have already worked with in Article 2, that is, the financing provisions of our agreement. Things like how much are the lenders committing to lend? When will the transaction close? When will the payments be made? How long is the money available? How long does the transaction last? What's the borrowing base for the amount that the borrower can borrow from the lenders? How will the money get repaid? Things like that. That brings us all the way down to voluntary prepayments. Remember, amortization and how the money gets repaid is really what we refer to as the repayment profile. Voluntary prepayments are a little bit different. Yes, they include giving the money back to the lenders, but unlike repayments, they're not scheduled. They're payments that are made earlier than otherwise expected. And because these are voluntary, it's at the borrower's discretion whether or not these payments are made. They have the right to do so. A voluntary prepayment falls into Article 2, like the rest of the repayment terms. Moving on, we have aircraft dispositions. This heading discusses how the aircraft can be disposed of. Now, dispositions actually covers a number of different concepts if you look the word up in the dictionary. It can include sales, other types of transfers, losses, anything basically that removes the asset from the pool of collateral and from the borrower's ownership. So aircraft dispositions are being discussed here, and it says that in certain circumstances they're permitted. Aircraft dispositions is a promise by the borrower. It's a promise about how aircraft can be sold. Now, the next thing, once you've identified that the topic is a covenant, the next thing you want to take into consideration is this a negative covenant? Is this an affirmative covenant? Or is this a financial covenant? Why do you want to take that into consideration? Because that's important to figuring out how exactly you want to draft it. If you're drafting a negative covenant, you'll be drafting it from a restrictive perspective. If you're drafting an affirmative covenant, you'll be drafting it as something the borrower is required to do. So consider, are aircraft dispositions negative covenants, affirmative covenants, or financial covenants? Moving on, we have aircraft remarketing. If you read this provision, and I'm sure that you have, this is the right of the borrower to choose to remarket the aircraft if a lease is in default. This is a right of the borrower and not an obligation of the borrower. However, if the borrower exercises this right, the borrower will have the obligation to behave in a certain way. So it sort of seems like it might be a blend of covenants with something else. Aircraft remarketing could be included under the covenant section, basically saying that if they choose to remarket the aircraft, they have to behave in a particular way. Or given the unique nature of this right, it might be in a standalone section all of its own. But what's for sure is when you're drafting it, you have to make sure that you're drafting in the obligations of the borrower to meet all of the conditions if it's going to exercise its right to remarket. Next, we have aircraft redelivery. Aircraft redelivery is also a covenant. It's because the borrower is agreeing that it will require the lessee to redeliver the aircraft and the assets in certain types of conditions. That's the borrower agreeing to do something. Next, we move on to concepts related to LTV. You'll recall LTV means loan to value. That's the concept that your loan, the outstanding amount of the money owed to the lenders compared to the value of the assets securing it, equals a certain threshold. This, if you read through all of these concepts, what you'll be able to tease out is with these concepts, the borrower's agreeing that a certain LTV ratio will be maintained, and if that's not maintained, there are certain consequences associated with that. As you may recall, that is a financial covenant. Next, we encounter mandatory prepayments. Like voluntary prepayments, this is how we're getting the money back to the lenders, and therefore it's included in Article 2. Unlike voluntary prepayments, this is actually an obligation of the borrower to make payments to the lenders. It is not their right to choose to do so or not do so. It is a requirement that they do so if certain events occur. So in a sense, it feels like a covenant because they're obligated to do so. But if you think about it, everything in the document is really a promise in one way or another. This is not really a promise that requires them to not behave in a certain way or to behave in a certain way. It's just a requirement. If certain things happen, they will then make certain payments. So the mandatory prepayment events themselves will show up in Article 2, but what you'll notice is often the events associated or trigger mandatory prepayment events relate to covenants that we've been discussing or that you have drafted. For instance, if you look at the first or the third bullet, those are covenants we just talked about. The first is related to the LTV, a financial covenant, and the third is related to aircraft dispositions, one of the first covenants we encountered in this term sheet. Think about how you've drafted those covenants and then how you would link them with requiring the prepayment of certain amounts. Next, we encounter insurance. This says that the insurance coverage for the asset has to be satisfied in a certain amount. This is once again a requirement on the borrower's behavior. Excuse me. Next, we have the easiest part, of course, it's certain covenants. The heading says right away that these are going to be covenants. This is the easy part. You'll notice it lists these things, these topics in brief, but when you go through the precedent, you'll recognize that these covenants are pretty typical. Excuse me. And you'll probably recognize how these have been drafted in the precedents you have access to. Next, we have significant lease provisions. This is the concept that each lease has certain types of provisions. The lenders have had a chance to diligence those provisions, have agreed to them, and agreed to proceed with the deal on the basis of those provisions. If those provisions changed, however, the deal might be quite different for the lender. Accordingly, the borrower may not change these certain provisions in the leases without first consulting the lenders. Therefore, The borrower is agreeing not to amend the lease with respect to these types of categories unless they get the consent of the lenders. This would be a covenant. Query whether it's a negative covenant, an affirmative covenant, or a financial covenant. In addition, as you're thinking through that, take a look at the different categories that are listed here and think about a lease that is 30, 100, 200 pages long has many provisions in it. Why are these the categories that we mentioned? Why are these the categories that the lenders require consent over? It's important to understand that so that you can understand why you're drafting a certain provision, and that can inform how you draft it. Next, we move on to the security interest. This is more descriptive and describes the package of collateral that we have securing the loans for the lenders. This isn't a covenant, but is more informational, and indeed you'll find that this will feed into your conditions precedent, because we have to have all of these security interests properly created and perfected in order to have the transaction that the lenders have agreed to. Moving on, we have servicing and disposition fees. These are the fees being paid to the servicer. And while it's a promise by the borrower to make a payment, this relates to a different entity. We care about this as lenders because we want to understand what's being paid to the servicer. That's cash flow that the borrower has to direct to somebody else instead of to the lenders. The lenders are concerned that it's not too high because that would be too difficult on the borrower from a financial perspective. They're also concerned that it's not too low because the lenders care that the servicer, i.e., the party that takes care of the assets, is incentivized to do a good job. After all, the assets are the second stop for the lenders, or in other words, where the lenders look if they're not getting paid back by the borrower like they should be. Moving on, we have events of default, which we'll discuss very soon in the semester, together with cure rights, as well as indemnities. I've skipped over lender protections, but those are template provisions that we've discussed in connection with Article 2. Finally, we have our list of conditions precedent here. This relates to the section you would be looking at when you're drafting the conditions precedent. Like covenants, there are conditions precedent that pop up in connection with certain other provisions in the term sheet, but this is a more extensive list of conditions precedent that the parties are expecting to see. Next, we have economic terms. Most of these economic terms showed up in Article 2, the interest rate, the margin, the upfront fee, but we also have what's called a priority of payments. This is also referred to sometimes as a waterfall. It's where the money that the borrower receives from the collateral goes, what it goes to pay. This is an agreed distribution mechanism, and while the distribution mechanism's agreed here, it's not really called a covenant, and it typically stands on its own. But what's very important in connection with this covenant is that we have a related covenant where the borrower in the first instance is agreeing to make timely payments of principal, interest, and any other amounts that it's obligated to pay under these documents. We're creating a promise to pay so that if the borrower fails to do so, then we have cause for recourse. The fact that once they pay, they have to pay in this manner is more mechanical and is not serving as the promise itself. So while this itself isn't a covenant, it reminds us we have to have the covenant where the borrower, as obvious as it sounds, has agreed to make timely payments under the documents. This completes the review of the term sheet in connection with the covenants. With each one, please remember to consider, is this considered a negative covenant? Is it considered an affirmative or operational covenant? And is it considered a financial covenant? The reason that we consider that is because, once again, that will help us figure out how to most efficiently, precisely, and clearly draft the covenant so the borrower knows how it has to behave, and so the lenders know what they can expect.